All right, now let's take a look at what happened at the beginning part of the 20th century. So we're building off the neoclassical model, and around the turn of the century, in the 1900s, turn of the 20th century, the neoclassical model reigned. And that means that during the teens and the 20s, there was this buildup of basically economists looking at the supply side of the economy, meaning that the government's role, remember what that means, government's role is minimal. Create the infrastructure, create the laws, have rule of law, create the kinds of things that would allow businesses to flourish. And they did. And then what happened in 1930? What happened in 1930, of course, was the Great Economic Depression of the 1930s, which hit the entire world, mainly the United States and Europe, but it spread everywhere else as a result. And what emerged from that was this guy named John Maynard Keynes. So the next topic we're going to talk about is known as Keynesian economics. So we'll first talk about who he was, then we'll talk about what his view was and how it shifted for another like 50, 60 years, economists' view of how to understand the economy. And it's one of the things that I think is really cool about economics is like you get these new events like the Great Depression, and it sends these economists back to the drawing board to say like, okay, but wait a second here. What we thought would happen isn't happening, and now we're in like a deep hole. Remember the economic depression of the 1930s was a deep, deep hole. And the result of that hole, it's like, okay, so what are the economic structures that exist in the neoclassical model to get us out of this hole? And basically in the neoclassical model, the way that economists thought the economy would get out of the hole is to cut regulations, cut costs for businesses, right? Maybe, and therefore they would create more employment, and as a result, people get their jobs back and demand would come back. But if things get really bad, it turns out that, and I like to say this because I think it's pretty direct and simple to understand, it's like during great economic crises, the only people who have any money are the governments. The only people that should be able or willing to take risks are the governments. And that's because they own the money, right? I mean, money comes from governments. It doesn't come from business and doesn't come from consumers. So governments are the ones that have to fix the problem. What Keynes did is he talked about how as opposed to the government just taking care of the supply side of the economy, meaning infrastructure, rule of law, and all of the things that would make businesses thrive, they also have a responsibility to take care of the demand side of the economy, which is in the sense increase government spending and actually become a demander of goods and services in an economy. Okay, so let's take a look more specifically at John Maynard Keynes. All right, again, we're talking about the early 20th century. The neoclassical view of economics was dominant until the beginning of the 1930s, and free markets were preferred as they were seen to be self-righting and would create a proper allocation of resources in society. Okay, that's basically like a nice little summary of what I just said in the introduction. Okay, now here comes Keynes. Okay, John Maynard Keynes. He is an English economist who lived from 1883 to 1946. He undoubtedly transformed economic thought, so much so that when we get to macroeconomics, which of course is the next unit of study after microeconomics, we'll see that he came up with a whole different diagram that really still to this day is like a schism or like a split in economic thought in terms of what exactly is the best way graphically to explain a macroeconomy, which is an economy for an entire country. He changed the notion of two aspects of the neoclassical model. One, he changed the focus from supply to demand. Number two, he changed the notion of the, quote, role of the government, right? And remember this about Keynes. Keynes said that the new role of the government was to become a participant and to care for aggregate demand, okay? And therefore, he said, in an economic crisis, it is the government that must spend more money and lower taxes to ease the crisis. So if you think about this guy, he's like sitting in England in the 1930s, and the whole world economic situation has collapsed. And he's like, man, what's the solution here? Right? Big businesses are firing people left and right, and therefore people don't have jobs, and guess what happens when you don't have a job? You don't spend money, and if you're not spending money, guess what? Businesses are going to go under even more, and as a result, you just have this like downward spiral right? And in the beginning, remember, there's only three participants in this economy in a very simplified way. There's consumers, there's suppliers, and there's the government. So if suppliers or producers are getting hammered because of an economic depression, they're out. They can't fix the problem. If consumers are losing their jobs, they're just thinking about themselves. They can't fix the problem. And what Keynes was like, look, man, there's only one entity left here, and it's the government. And what he suggested is that the government needed to take an active role in the demand side of the economy. Okay? So, look at this. In crisis, governments should spend their way out of it. And like I like to say, they're the only ones with the cash. Okay? So he promoted fiscal policies. Now, we haven't talked about what that means. Fiscal policy is a policy of a government that has to do with the government either spending more money or spending less money, or the government raising people's taxes or lowering taxes. That's fiscal policy. Just that. Just hold on to that. That's all you got to worry about right now. Okay? So fiscal policies, managing taxing and spending, and monetary policies, which are another tool that the government has, which is managing two things also, interest rates and the money supply. Okay? So fiscal policy, taxing and spending. Monetary policy is interest rates and money supply. And those are basically the two tools the government has to manage the demand side of the economy. Fiscal policy, one tool. Monetary policy, the other tool. Okay? And each one of those tools have two aspects. Cool. So this became then, or Keynesian economics becomes known as demand side theories or demand management policies, okay? And his theories gained widespread support throughout up until the 1970s. So we're going from like 1930 to 1970s, 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 40, 50 years, right? Until Keynesian economics couldn't explain this phenomenon of what's called stagflation. We should have to worry about that right now, but it's a phenomenon that happened in the 1970s where there were persistent levels of high unemployment and also high inflation. And when we get to macroeconomics, we'll talk more about what that means. But basically, inflation is the rise of average price levels, and unemployment is the rise of people not working. And usually those two things have a negative relationship to one another. Because if people lose their jobs, then they're not going to buy things, so prices aren't going to go up. But in the 1970s, there was a situation where both of those were true, which is a situation that governments found very, very difficult to get themselves out of. And certainly during this time, the Keynesian model broke down. And as a result, we're going to see another shift away from Keynes. Now, Keynes doesn't go away. Keynes is in our textbook. Keynes is alive today. It's a different way of looking at it. And what I like to say as I close up this conversation here about Keynes is like, he's talking about a different role of the government, okay? So it's just like someone viewing parents and wondering what the parent's role is, right? Economists are looking at the government as the parent of the economy. It's like, what's their role in terms of managing this house or this country and this economy, right? And the neoclassicists tend to focus on the government's main number one obligation is to supply, and to suppliers, to the supply side, and what Keynes said is, no, you got to take care of demand as well. And if you want to think about some examples of demand side policies that existed during the 1930s, if you've ever been to the United States, or if you lived in the United States, or you've ever seen photographs of the United States, guess what was built in the 1930s? The Empire State Building in New York City, the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco, and the most ridiculous jobs program the government's ever put together, I think, is Mount Rushmore, which is a mountain out in the Midwest of the United States, where they actually just created jobs to have men go and carve the faces of 4 prominent presidents of the United States in this huge mountain. Like, that's just government spending money. And that's an example of Keynesian economics, that they are going to create government programs by spending money that they don't have. That's another thing Keynes said. They need to spend more money than they have available to them. So they need to put themselves in debt in order to stimulate the economy, because they're the only ones with the cash, by creating jobs programs. The Empire State Building, 1930s, built with government money. The Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco, built with government money. Mount Rushmore in the Midwest of the United States, built with government money. And that's a great little example of The ways that Hoover Dam is another example right outside of Las Vegas. That dam was built in the 1930s, and basically it's just the government creating projects so that people could have a job again. Okay? So Keynes never goes away, my friends. He's going to come roaring back when we get to macroeconomics, because his way of looking at the economy is still alive today, and there are many economics teachers out there who prefer Keynes over the neoclassical model. You as a student, guess what? You got to learn them both. All right, my friends, rolling on to the next video. We'll see you there.